The year was 1503, the month was August, and the city of Rome was a furnace. A suffocating heat, the infamous scirocco wind, pressed down upon the 7 hills, while from the low-lying marshes crept the invisible killer, the aria cattiva, the bad air. In the apostolic palace, within the fortified heart of the Vatican, a man lay dying. This was no ordinary man. He was Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, the Vicar of Christ, a figure of such immense power and terrifying reputation that his name was whispered with a mixture of awe and revulsion across Christendom. As fever racked his 72-year-old body, a far more sinister rumor crept through the city's fetid alleyways. Poison. Was this the hand of God, a final divine judgment on a notoriously sinful pontiff? Or was it the work of his enemies, a cold-blooded assassination? Or, in the most lurid twist of all, had the master of poisoners been undone by his own deadly craft? To understand the vortex of rumor and reality that surrounded the death of Pope Alexander VI, we must first journey back, not just days or weeks, but decades, to the very source of Borgia power. Rodrigo Borgia was not a product of the Roman aristocracy or the great Italian banking families that had long dominated the papacy. He was an outsider, a Spaniard from the Kingdom of Valencia, whose fortunes were tied irrevocably to his maternal uncle, Alonso de Borgia, who ascended to the papal throne in 1455 as Pope Calixtus III. It was under his uncle's patronage that the young Rodrigo, handsome, intelligent, and insatiably ambitious, was made a cardinal and vice-chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, a position of immense administrative power and wealth which he would hold for more than 35 years, serving under 5 different popes. He learned the intricate, deadly dance of Roman politics from the inside, mastering its rhythms of bribery, nepotism, and ruthless pragmatism. The Italy of the late 15th century was not a unified nation but a fractured mosaic of competing city-states, duchies, and kingdoms, all vying for dominance. Milan under the Sforza, Florence under the Medici, the Kingdom of Naples, and the powerful Republic of Venice. At the center of this web lay the Papal States, a territory that was in theory the temporal domain of the Pope, but in practice was a patchwork of lands controlled by powerful, rebellious baronial families like the Orsini and the Colonna, who treated the papacy as their personal prize. When Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, the ensuing conclave was a masterclass in simony, a transactional affair where votes were bought and sold with promises of land, titles, and cold, hard ducats. Rodrigo Borgia, the wealthiest of the cardinals, outbid them all, securing his election and taking the name Alexander VI. His coronation was an event of unparalleled magnificence, a spectacle meant to declare that a new, formidable power had arrived. But it was a power built not on spiritual authority, but on a foundation of secular ambition, dynastic obsession, and a chilling willingness to sanctify any means necessary to achieve his ends. He was a man of his time, a Renaissance prince cloaked in the robes of a pontiff, and his primary instruments of power were not scripture and prayer, but his own children, Cesare, Lucrezia, Giovanni, and Giofra, whose lives and marriages would become the chess pieces in his great and terrible game for control of Italy. The papacy of Alexander VI was a decade-long masterclass in the consolidation of power, a reign defined by an atmosphere of suffocating paranoia and the ever-present whisper of poison. From the moment he ascended the throne of St. Peter, Alexander moved with breathtaking speed to secure his position, understanding that in the viper's nest of Roman politics, vulnerability was a death sentence. His primary goal was twofold: to crush the power of the recalcitrant Roman barons who had for centuries challenged papal authority, and to carve out from the chaos of the Papal States a hereditary duchy for his family, a Borgia kingdom that would outlast his own mortal reign. His children were the key. His daughter Lucrezia became a luminous, tragic pawn, married off and then unmarried through annulment or the convenient death of a husband, to seal shifting political alliances with the Sforza of Milan or the House of Aragon in Naples. His son Giovanni was made Duke of Gandia and commander of the papal armies, only to be mysteriously murdered and thrown into the Tiber River, a crime that some whispered was orchestrated by his own jealous brother, Cesare. But it was Cesare Borgia who would become the true and terrible avatar of his father's ambition. Together, father and son formed a symbiotic partnership of terrifying efficiency. Alexander, from the gilded halls of the Vatican, provided the papal sanction, the immense wealth of the church, and the diplomatic legitimacy, while Cesare, on the blood-soaked battlefields of the Romagna, provided the sword, the fire, and the fear. This campaign to centralize power required vast sums of money, and when the traditional revenues of the church proved insufficient, Alexander turned to a more sinister form of fundraising. Cardinals, nobles, and wealthy officials who fell afoul of the Borgias would often die suddenly, their immense fortunes conveniently reverting to the papal treasury. It was in this context that the legend of Cantarella was born, a colorless, tasteless poison, said to be a variation of arsenic, which the Borgias allegedly used with surgical precision. The host of a Borgia dinner party might retire to bed feeling perfectly healthy, only to be gripped by a violent sickness in the night, dying in agony days later. The fear was palpable. Ambassadors wrote home in coded messages, their dispatches filled with accounts of suspicious deaths and the palpable sense that no one was safe. Did the Borgias truly possess a secret, undetectable poison? Or was the idea of the poison their most effective weapon? In a world of shifting allegiances, the fear of a poisoned chalice was enough to keep wavering allies in line and terrify potential enemies into submission. The truth is likely a mixture of both. Arsenic was a well-known poison, and its use in Renaissance Italy was far from unique to the Borgias. But they, with their foreign origins, their flagrant nepotism, and their ruthless success, became the ultimate symbol of this dark art. Their reputation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every sudden death in their circle was attributed to them, every illness seen as the slow work of Cantarella, cementing their image as diabolical figures who had mastered the chemistry of death itself. The true engine of the Borgia enterprise, the incarnation of its ruthless will, was Cesare Borgia. History remembers him through the cold, calculating eyes of Niccolò Machiavelli, who saw in Cesare the perfect model for his ideal prince, a man unbound by conventional morality, who understood that power rests not on goodwill, but on the judicious application of violence and the cultivation of fear. Initially destined for the church, like his father, Cesare was made a cardinal at the tender age of 17, a position he despised. He was a man of action, a warrior trapped in the crimson robes of a cleric. His brother Giovanni's murder in 1497, a crime that remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries, proved to be Cesare's opportunity. Whether he was responsible or not, he benefited immensely. He renounced his cardinalate, the first person in history to do so, and stepped into his brother's role as the secular, military arm of the papacy. With his father's blessing and a flood of papal gold, Cesare embarked on a series of brilliant and brutal military campaigns in the Romagna region of central Italy. His goal, and Alexander's, was to systematically dismantle the power of the petty tyrants who ruled cities like Imola, Forlì, and Urbino, and unify them into a single, centralized state under his personal command. His motto was, "Aut Caesar, aut nihil," either Caesar or nothing, a declaration of ambition so total it left no room for compromise. He was a master of strategy, but also of treachery. In a famous incident, he invited his mutinous captains, themselves brutal and experienced mercenaries, to the town of Senigallia under the pretense of reconciliation, only to have them seized and strangled to death. Machiavelli was present and recorded the event with detached admiration for its sheer amoral efficiency. This campaign of conquest made the Borgias the most feared and hated family in Italy. Every city Cesare conquered, every lord he deposed, created a new network of vengeful enemies sworn to their destruction. The Orsini family, one of the great Roman clans, once allies, became their most bitter foes after Cesare's betrayal at Senigallia. The great powers of Europe watched with alarm. Venice feared the growth of a strong state in central Italy. France, a key ally, began to see the Borgias' ambition as a threat to their own Italian interests. Cesare's success was inextricably linked to his father's life. Only Alexander's status as pope gave Cesare the legitimacy and resources to wage his wars. Without the pope, Cesare was just another warlord, his newly forged duchy a house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze to collapse it. This stark reality, understood by all, meant that the 72-year-old pope's health was a matter of intense political speculation. His death would not just create a power vacuum in the Vatican, it would trigger the complete and immediate unraveling of the entire Borgia project. The stakes could not have been higher. For the Borgias' enemies, assassinating the pope was not merely an act of revenge, It was a strategic necessity, the only sure way to destroy Caesare and everything he had built. The air in Rome grew thick not just with the summer heat, but with plots and counterplots, creating the perfect conditions for the catastrophe that was to come. The final act of the Borgia drama began fittingly at a dinner party. On the evening of the 5th of August, 1503, Pope Alexander and his son Cesare were guests at a villa on the outskirts of Rome belonging to the wealthy Cardinal Adriano Castellesi Corneto. The city was in the grip of what the Romans called the canicula, the dog days of summer, a period notorious for its oppressive heat and the deadly fevers that swept through the population. The villa, situated on a hill, was meant to offer a respite from the city's foul air, the aria cattiva that was blamed for the seasonal pestilence. It was at this dinner that the most famous, most dramatic, and most disputed version of events is said to have unfolded. The story, popularized by later chroniclers hostile to the Borgias, is a masterpiece of dark irony. According to this narrative, Alexander and Cesare had arrived at the cardinal's villa with a sinister purpose: to poison their host. Cardinal Corneto was immensely wealthy, and his death would have conveniently transferred his fortune and his valuable benefices into the Borgia coffers, providing much-needed funds for Cesare's ongoing military campaigns. The plan was simple and classic Borgia. A servant, loyal to Cesare, was to serve the target from a specially prepared flagon of poisoned wine. But, in a twist worthy of a Greek tragedy, a fatal mistake occurred. Either through a blunder by the servant, or because the Pope, suffering from the heat, called for a drink before the poisoned cup had been correctly presented, the flagons were mixed up. The Pope and his son were served the very poison they had intended for another. They drank deeply, sealing their own fates. This version of the story is almost too perfect, too poetically just. The great poisoners, undone by their own signature weapon. It plays directly into the myth of the Borgias as figures of almost supernatural evil, punished in a manner that perfectly mirrored their own sins. The tale spread like wildfire, becoming the accepted truth for centuries. It neatly explained why not only the Pope and Cesare fell ill, but also their host, Cardinal Corneto, who also suffered a violent, though not fatal, sickness. In this telling, he was the intended victim who narrowly escaped. But as we peel back the layers of propaganda and rumor, this cinematic narrative begins to fray. It relies heavily on hearsay and the accounts of men writing with a clear political agenda to demonize the now-fallen Borgia family. There are no reliable, first-hand accounts from the dinner itself that confirm such a plot. The story of the swapped goblets only appears in chronicles written years, sometimes decades, after the event. Was it a real event? A botched assassination that backfired spectacularly? Or was it a convenient fiction, a story crafted after the fact to provide a simple, morally satisfying explanation for a complex and terrifying event? The dramatic irony is compelling, but the truth may be something far more mundane, and in its own way, far more terrifying. Let us, for a moment, set aside the lurid tale of poisoned wine and swapped flagons, and approach the events of August 1503 not as a playwright, but as a forensic pathologist. The day after the fateful dinner at Cardinal Corneto's villa, both Pope Alexander and his son Cesare were struck down by a violent illness. Contemporary accounts, particularly the dispatches of the Venetian and Florentine ambassadors and the detailed diary of the papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, provide a clinical, if horrifying, list of symptoms. They began with a sudden, intense fever, which came in relentless, recurring waves. This was accompanied by violent bouts of vomiting and agonizing stomach pains. As the illness progressed, it developed into what was described as a bloody flux, or dysentery. For days, the two most powerful men in Rome were confined to their beds, prostrated by an affliction that drained them of all strength. Now, consider the classic profile of arsenic poisoning, the most likely candidate for the legendary Cantarella. While arsenic does cause severe gastrointestinal distress, the symptoms described do not perfectly align. Acute arsenic poisoning often involves a burning in the throat, difficulty swallowing, and more pronounced neurological symptoms like seizures or delirium, which are not prominently featured in the most reliable accounts of Alexander's illness. The progression of the Borgia sickness, with its characteristic intermittent high fever, points towards a different culprit, one that had haunted Rome for millennia. We must return to the aria cattiva, the bad air. The Romans were not wrong to fear it. They simply misunderstood its mechanism. The bad air did not carry a poisonous miasma from the swamps, but it did carry something far more deadly, the Anopheles mosquito. The stagnant pools of water in and around the city were perfect breeding grounds for these insects, which were the vectors for the Plasmodium falciparum parasite, the agent of the most lethal form of malaria. Falciparum malaria, also known as tertian fever, is characterized by precisely the symptoms Alexander and Cesare displayed: recurring high fevers, chills, headaches, nausea, vomiting, and, in severe cases, complications like renal failure and bloody stools. It was an annual scourge in Rome. Every summer, as the heat and humidity rose, the Roman fever would claim thousands of lives, from the poorest commoner to the highest prelate. In fact, historical records show that the summer of 1503 was a particularly bad year for the fever. Many others in the city, including Cardinal Cornito, their host, were also stricken. The fact that Alexander, Cesare, and their host all fell ill at the same time does not necessarily point to a single cup of poisoned wine. It could just as easily, and perhaps more plausibly, point to a single evening spent in a mosquito-infested location. All three men, sitting together in a hilltop villa as dusk fell, would have been equally exposed to the bites of infected insects. The mundane truth may be that the Pope was not felled by the hand of an assassin, but by the bite of an insect, a random biological event that paid no heed to power, wealth, or station. This explanation lacks the satisfying drama of the poison plot, but it aligns far more closely with the medical evidence and the epidemiological reality of 16th century Rome. Whether the agent was a chemical compound or a microscopic parasite, its effect on the 72-year-old pontiff was catastrophic. What followed the onset of the illness was a 12-day descent into a living hell, a period of agony meticulously, almost clinically, documented by the ever-present master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard. While Cesare, younger and stronger, battled the sickness in his own apartments, the Pope's aging body began to fail in the most horrific manner imaginable. The fever was relentless, a fire in his blood that could not be quenched. He was bled repeatedly by his physicians, the standard treatment of the day, a practice that would have only weakened him further, depleting his body of fluids and hastening his decline. He was confined to his chambers in the Vatican, the windows sealed shut against the dreaded bad air, turning the room into a suffocating, airless sweatbox. We can only imagine the scene. The Pope, once a figure of imposing physical presence and vitality, now reduced to a groaning, delirious wreck, his lavish papal vestments replaced with sweat-soaked bed linens. The sensory details passed down to us, our stomach churning. The room would have smelled of sickness, of sweat, of blood, and of the frantic, aromatic concoctions of his helpless doctors. As the days wore on, a grotesque transformation began to take place. Burchard and other eyewitnesses describe how the Pope's body began to putrefy while he was still, technically, alive, likely exacerbated by the extreme fever and failing circulation. His tissues began to break down. His skin took on a dark, bruised, almost blackish hue. His face, once handsome and commanding, swelled into an unrecognizable mask of bloated flesh. His tongue grew so engorged it filled his entire mouth, protruding between his lips, which were themselves swollen and black. His body became a living symbol of corruption, a physical manifestation of the moral decay his enemies had long accused him of. On the 18th of August, after 12 days of unrelenting torment, Alexander VI finally succumbed. He had received his last rites, but the sheer horror of his physical decomposition seemed, to the horrified onlookers, a sign of something more than mere disease. It was seen as a diabolical end, a physical damnation that presaged an eternal one. The man who had commanded kings and reshaped the map of Italy had been conquered from within. His body turned into a vessel of such spectacular decay that it seemed to mock the very notion of papal infallibility and sacredness. The visceral, unsparing accounts of his final days ensured that his death would not be remembered as a tragedy, but as a grotesque spectacle, the final, horrific act in the dark opera of the Borgia. The death of a pope is always a moment of immense significance, but the death of Alexander VI was followed by a scene of chaos and degradation unparalleled in the history of the papacy. The moment his last agonized breath had been drawn, the carefully maintained order of the apostolic palace dissolved. The very servants who had attended him, who had bowed before him just days earlier, descended upon his private apartments like vultures. They stripped the rooms bare, looting tapestries, silver, and furniture, even tearing the clothes from his still warm corpse. His body, now an object of revulsion rather than reverence, was abandoned for a time, left to fester in the oppressive August heat. It was Johann Burchard, the dutiful master of ceremonies, who was left with the ghastly task of preparing the pontiff for burial. What he witnessed and recorded has haunted historians for centuries. The process of putrefaction, already advanced while Alexander was alive, accelerated with terrifying speed after his death. The body swelled to grotesque proportions, losing all human shape. Burchard wrote that its length and breadth became almost equal, a bloated, monstrous parody of a human form. The skin turned the color of the blackest cloth, and a foul, corrupt fluid began to seep from its orifices. The stench was unbearable. When the carpenters arrived with the coffin, they found it was too small. The papal corpse, which should have been handled with the utmost solemnity, was subjected to a final, brutal indignity. Burchard describes how the porters, with little reverence, rolled the body onto a sheet, and with their fists and feet, began to pound and shove the putrefying mass into the wooden box. During this gruesome process, the body released a final, explosive burst of foul gas, a last exhalation of corruption. This horrifying spectacle was not a private affair. The doors of the Vatican were eventually opened, and the Roman people, along with clergy and foreign dignitaries, were allowed to file past the body as it lay in state in St. Peter's Basilica. What they saw confirmed every dark rumor. The monstrous, blackened, and decomposing corpse was taken as irrefutable proof of the poison story, and more than that, as a sign of a pact with the devil. For his enemies, it was the ultimate propaganda victory. The physical decay of Alexander's body became a powerful metaphor for the moral decay of his papacy. It was as if his Sinchi's lust, his greed, his simony, his ruthless ambition had manifested physically, rotting his flesh from the inside out and leaving behind a testament of his damnation for all to see. The sacred office of the papacy had been occupied by a man whose end was so unspeakably vile that it stripped away all pretense of holiness, leaving only the memory of a terrifying and grotesque mortality. The death of Alexander VI was not merely a personal or spiritual event. It was a political earthquake that sent shockwaves across the Italian peninsula, shattering the Borgia dream in an instant. The entire edifice of Borgia power, so carefully and ruthlessly constructed over a decade, rested on a single pillar, the papal authority of Alexander. With that pillar gone, the entire structure came crashing down. The critical factor in this collapse was Cesare Borgia's own illness. Whether he was suffering from the same malarial fever as his father, or had indeed ingested a sublethal dose of poison, the result was the same. At the precise moment when he needed his full strength, his cunning, and his fearsome presence to secure his future, he was prostrate, delirious with fever, and utterly incapacitated. As he himself would later lament to Machiavelli, he had planned for every contingency upon his father's death, except one, that he himself would be on the verge of death at the same time. The news of the Pope's death and Cesare's illness was the signal for which all their enemies had been waiting. It was an open invitation for revenge. The Orsini family, whose leaders Cesare had treacherously executed, immediately raised an army and marched on Rome, thirsty for Borgia blood. The Colonna, the other great Roman baronial clan crushed by Alexander, re-emerged from exile to reclaim their lost lands. The cities of the Romagna, which Cesare had conquered through violence and fear, one by one began to rebel, overthrowing their Borgia-appointed governors. The carefully built Duchy of Romagna, the intended heart of a new Borgia kingdom, dissolved back into chaos in a matter of weeks. The College of Cardinals, now free from Alexander's intimidating presence, moved to elect a successor. They chose a compromise candidate, Francesco Todeschini Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius III. His reign, however, lasted a mere 26 days before he too succumbed to illness. The subsequent conclave saw the final poetic triumph of the Borgia's greatest enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. A bitter rival whom Alexander had driven into exile for years, della Rovere was elected as Pope Julius II. Known as the Warrior Pope, Julius was just as ambitious and ruthless as Alexander had been, but his ambition was for the Church, not for his family. He immediately set about undoing the Borgia legacy, systematically seizing Cesare's remaining possessions for the papacy. Cesare, now a general without an army and a duke without a duchy, was arrested. He would eventually escape, only to die a soldier's death a few years later while fighting as a mercenary in Spain. The great project was over. A single death, be it from poison or pestilence, had been enough to completely realign the political map of Italy, demonstrating with brutal clarity the fragile, personal nature of power in Renaissance Europe. 5 centuries later, the question lingers, suspended in the amber of history. Was it poison or pestilence? Let us weigh the evidence like a court of inquiry, examining the arguments for each case, sifting through the layers of propaganda, myth, and medical reality. The case for poison is, without a doubt, the more compelling narrative. It rests primarily on the Borgia's fearsome reputation. They had cultivated an image of being masters of assassination, and so, when they died in a manner that seemed suspicious, poison was the most natural and widely accepted conclusion. The timing is crucial to this theory. The illness struck directly after a dinner party with a wealthy cardinal who was a logical target for expropriation. The fact that both father and son fell ill simultaneously strongly suggests a common source, and a poisoned flagon of wine provides a neat, dramatic explanation. The accounts of contemporary chroniclers like Paolo Giovio and Francesco Guicciardini, though written later and with a clear anti-Borgia bias, explicitly detail the story of the swapped goblets and the botched assassination plot. For the Borgias' many enemies, this narrative was not just believable, it was necessary. It provided a morally coherent end to a morally bankrupt reign. However, the case for pestilence, for malaria, is arguably stronger from a scientific and historical standpoint. The location and time of year Rome in the suffocating heat of August were the perfect breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito and the deadly falciparum malaria it carried. The Roman fever was a known and terrifying killer, responsible for countless deaths each summer. The symptoms meticulously recorded by eyewitnesses, the recurring high fevers, the vomiting, the dysentery are a textbook match for a severe malarial infection, more so than for classic arsenic poisoning. Furthermore, it wasn't just Alexander and Cesare who fell ill. Their host, Cardinal Cornito, the supposed target of the poison plot, also contracted a severe fever, as did many others in the Vatican and throughout Rome during that same period. A city-wide epidemic provides a far more logical explanation for the widespread illness than a series of coordinated but separate poisonings. The simultaneous onset of sickness in Alexander and Cesare could easily be explained by them both being bitten by infected mosquitoes during the same evening at Cardinal Cornito's villa. The poison story, while theatrically satisfying, requires us to believe in a level of incompetency, clumsy servant, a mixed-up cup that seems at odds with the Borgia's reputation for ruthlessness and efficiency. The malaria theory requires us only to accept that the Pope, like any other human being of his time, was vulnerable to the natural dangers of his environment. In the end, the enduring power of the Borgia story lies not in the forensic details of Alexander's death, but in the profound question of why the myth of poison has so completely overshadowed the probability of disease. The poison narrative has survived for 500 years because it is a better story. It is a tale of hubris and nemesis, of Greek tragedy played out in the heart of the Catholic Church. It presents a world governed by human agency, where evil is not a random force but a calculated strategy, and where justice, however dark and twisted, ultimately prevails. A death by a conspirator's vial is a reflection of the deceased's life. It implies that Alexander's end was a direct consequence of his actions, a reaping of what he had sown. It turns history into a morality play, with a clear villain and a satisfyingly just, if gruesome, conclusion. By contrast, a death by mosquito bite is frustratingly mundane. It is random, impersonal, and anticlimactic. It speaks not to the grand themes of power and corruption, but to the biological fragility of the human body. It reduces the larger-than-life pontiff not to a damned soul receiving his just deserts, but to a mere statistic, another victim of the annual Roman fever. The historical truth is that what killed Pope Alexander VI matters far less than the world he inhabited and helped to create a world so steeped in intrigue, betrayal, and violence that a death by poison was not only plausible but, in the minds of his contemporaries, almost a certainty. The true poison was not cantarella in a wine goblet. It was the insatiable ambition that drove him, the nepotism that defined his reign, and the climate of fear that he perfected as an instrument of state. He and Cesare had injected a toxin into the political life of Italy, and whether his own death came from a similar poison or from the unthinking bite of an insect, The result was a fittingly catastrophic end to a spectacular and terrifying reign. His legacy is not a medical mystery, but a timeless lesson on the corrupting nature of absolute power and the grotesque, often ignominious, mortality that awaits even those who sit on the highest thrones of the world.